Hello and welcome to 1 Week, 1 Year, a podcast where we watch and discuss a year of film history every week, starting in 1895, the dawn of cinema. And this year is 1929, the end of the 20s, and our 30-something year of doing this. I'm one of your hosts, Chris Ellie. I'm a film projectionist in between bouts of running Oppenheimer. And joining me, as always, is...
I'm Glenn Covell. I'm a filmmaker in between bouts of watching Oppenheimer.
What's going on, Glenn?
Not much. I'm gearing up to go on a trip to Ireland next week, so that should be fun. Or this week, I should say.
What are your plans?
I'll just walk around, drink some booze, go look at some lovely landscapes.
I never liked Guinness, but everyone was like, oh, but if you try Guinness in Ireland, it's so much better. It tastes so different.
It's still
bad. No.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe you can form your own opinion. But I thought that it also tasted like water in Ireland. Kiss the Blarney Stone.
I know for a fact that I'm not going to kiss the Blarney Stone. That is not part of the itinerary. So.
Really? I mean, I didn't when I went to Ireland as well, so...
There you go.
Yeah.
I'll kiss some other stones.
Yeah, find a rock on the ground and kiss it for me, all right?
Some Neolithic rock will get a smooch.
Well, in case you're... we have this podcast in multiple formats that you may be aware of, so I just wanted to highlight that for all y'all out there in podcast land. We've got an audio version that you may be listening to on your podcast app of choice. Everyone's always like, is it on Spotify? And I'm like, yes, it's on Spotify. Listen to it.
It's on all the things.
It's on everything. If it's on a place where you get podcasts, it's probably there. But then we also have a video version with some little bonus stuff, some posters that you're seeing, sometimes a few clips. But now that we're in the copyright era, it's a little less. It doesn't show you everything that it used to, but still, there's some fun stuff in there.
We can't just play like the whole movie in the background while we're talking about it anymore.
Would be nice.
Yeah, but
we're not talking about now. With our current copyright system, we're talking about 1929. So why don't we get ourselves into the vibe of 1929, that horrible Great Depression era, by giving us a little bit of news to give us some context for 1929. Why don't you take it away, Glenn?
The news of the year, 1929. First in the funnies, Tintin and Popeye debut in newspapers. Vatican City is established as a sovereign enclave separate from Italy. Massacre on St. Valentine's Day. 5 rivals of Al Capone are gunned down in Chicago. The first Monaco Grand Prix is held. Scientists around the world experiment with color television. The Young Plan establishes the amount of reparations to be paid to Weimar Germany for their crimes in the Great War. The Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes changes its name to the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. Panic on Wall Street. The New York Stock Exchange loses $30 billion in the span of 5 days and plunges the world into a Great Depression. Values plummet, and people do too.
Dark.
The Museum of Modern Art opens in New York City. The first Academy Awards are held in the Roosevelt Hotel in Hollywood. The University of Southern California breaks ground, founded by Douglas Fairbanks, D.W. Griffith, Ernst Lubitsch, and other Hollywood royalty. USC becomes the first university to offer a Bachelor of Arts in Film.
Some important Hollywood news at the end there.
There's no business like show business. That's what I always say.
I feel like since we talked about the movies that actually won awards that at that first award show, it's sort of like we've talked about that already.
Yeah, the original Academy Awards was held in 29, but covered 27 and 28. Chiefly, the winners were from 27. In particular, Wings and Sunrise.
Although we'll be talking about the winner, the Best Picture winner at the 1930 awards this episode.
Yes. which I imagine we'll be covering most Best Picture winners as we go through time. Most if not
I don't
all.
know. Do you want to make that a point? Like we got to watch all the Oscar winners.
I don't know. I made a spreadsheet of every like Palm winner and Academy and Best Picture winner and every movie on Roger Ebert's Great Movies list. And I was like, and the AFI as well, the AFI Top 100 and the IMDb 250. I made a wild spreadsheet, but we don't need to be beholden to what the popular world tells us is important, but also they're probably important. I don't know. Yeah.
That's kind of how I feel about it. Like, we'll probably end up watching a lot of them, but not necessarily make it like a rule.
There is a rule. But why don't we get started, as we usually do, with a little aperitif of 1 week, 1 reel.
An aperitif.
Yeah, it's like an appetizer, but French.
But exactly.
Hors d'oeuvres. Well, we've got 2 right now.
I think we should start with a little animated short.
Let's start with a cartoon.
A Disney cartoon. Not a Mickey Mouse cartoon this time, though.
The inaugural Silly Symphony.
Indeed. And
which is called Skeleton Dance.
Skeleton Dance. What a picture.
How often do we say what a picture?
I think every episode, but it applies here because Skeleton Dance is great. I love it.
It's really good. Yeah.
It is what it sounds like. It's a bunch of skeletons dancing.
Have you seen this before?
I have not. I'd seen like probably clips of it and like images from it for sure, but I'd never just like sat and watched all several minutes of it. And it's just spooky fun.
Yeah, very Halloween-y. It's got kind of a darker aesthetic than most Disney stuff, but also it's like fun, kid-friendly dark aesthetic. You know?
It's spooky fun. It's gravestones and bats and clouds and skeletons.
And owls and
taking each other's bones and playing their spines like a xylophone.
Iconic.
Things that skeletons do.
This really could be called like things that skeletons do. It's the first in the Pixar model of what do things get up to when we're not looking at them.
It was the night the skeletons came to life.
Oh my god. There's no plot in this really. It's just it becomes a dark and spooky night, and the skeletons come out of the ground, and then they just start having a jaunty, fun time, jumping around and dancing and playing music, and then it becomes daytime, and they're like, "Oh, dang, got to get back in the ground."
It definitely feels like it was made to kind of showcase sync sound, which it was.
Right. Being a silly symphony, it's this series is specifically like let's do sound cartoons. Which not all of Mickey Mouse was up until this point, although all the silent Mickey Mouse cartoons were converted to sound. So I think everything from Steamboat Willie on that Disney released was sound. Some kind of interesting stuff that happened to this movie. I will say that there's a lot more squashy and stretchy stuff going on than any other Disney stuff we've seen so far. When the owl hoots, its whole body kind of bows and expands and contracts, and they do some relatively complex animation with the skeleton spinning around and kind of moving closer to the camera that very drastically changes the perspective. Stuff that isn't just moving things around as much as like actually kind of drawing perspective changes, which is more complex.
Like, the thing with the skeleton like coming towards the camera, like its face getting bigger, is it's like it's really simplified. It's a really simplified skull when it's far away, but it like the animation actually the drawing gets more complex as it gets closer to the camera. In quotes, if you're listening to the podcast, it's not a real camera because it's animated. But I thought that was a cool kind of thing where it's like the actual complexity of the drawing increases as the eye gets closer to it.
Yeah. This was also, like many of early Disney movies or cartoon shorts, was chiefly animated by Iwerks.
Mm-hmm.
And I was noticing at the beginning of this movie, this might have been the case with Steamboat Willie as well, I'm not sure, but it said that it was a Cinephone production. So Cinephone was a knockoff of Phonofilm. There's a guy named Pat Powers who made this company that distributed Disney movies up until 29-30.
Mm-hmm.
And he was also someone who used to be kind of involved with Lee DeForest Company. He hired a technician from Lee DeForest Company, and then made a knockoff of Phonofilm. And so he distributed Disney's movies, and then was responsible for the sound on film technology of these early Disney films. And Iwerks was also kind of getting a little frustrated with working with Walt Disney at this point. And so pretty soon after this was made, he jumped ship to make his own film studio under Pat Powers. He kind of poached him from Disney because Disney didn't treat him with a lot of respect, it seems like. Which checks out.
Another fun fact about this movie that I read is that it was, at least initially, banned in Denmark for being, quote, too macabre.
Was that a Danish accent?
No, that was sort of a Bill Hader as Vincent Price accent. But, Denmark thought it was too macabre.
There are some other Disney cartoons that from this year that we didn't watch for the podcast, but are similarly macabre, like Hell's Bells, which is about Satan in hell. It's another silly symphony, but it's not on Disney Plus, unlike this one, because it's too it's a little too macabre.
Oh wow, too macabre for Disney Plus.
I know, just like Free Solo. I guess one other thing they'll say about this movie is that like they have a lot of fun, inventive ways that they kind of use the bones for like visual gags. Like there's a part where all four skeletons kind of crash into each other and then turn into like an 8-legged monstrosity of bones. But then, like using them as mallets to play xylophones, all that kind of thing.
Yeah. Everyone knows that when you play a skeleton, when you play a rib cage or a spine of a skeleton, it sounds like a xylophone. Another short that we watched that is also a little spooky, I guess.
Yeah, a little macabre as well.
Indeed. Is Chien Andalou.
Thank you for being the one to pronounce that.
Yeah.
This is a joint venture between Salvador Dali and Louis Buñuel.
Mm-hmm.
And very, very famous abstract silent avant-garde jam.
A classic surrealist film.
Surrealist, yes.
Un Chien Andalou in English translates to the Andalusian dog.
Mm-hmm.
Which I read why it's called that. I don't even remember what it is. It's a surrealist thing. It's like there's no dog in the movie.
No.
This movie is deliberately intended to be not necessarily confusing, but like kind of inscrutable.
Right. There's nothing to scrute here. It's a bunch of I guess it's like a lot of just series of just like violent, disturbing imagery.
It kind of operates on like dream or nightmare logic of like kind of free flowing, almost like stream of consciousness stuff where like characters and things appear or disappear. Time moves in weird ways. There's a couple title cards that are like a week later, 8 years later. Like it's sort of, it's all kind of a dream-like series of bizarre imagery and scenes.
But in many ways, it's kind of using film language to do that sort of stuff, like with the time title cards. Like, you can't, Salvador Dali chiefly makes paintings, and you can't really do a time jump in a painting. So that's sort of something that is kind of that they're able to play with by making it this visual medium. Another thing that they do is they create these kind of visual juxtapositions between different shots, like a match cut between a hairy armpit and a sea urchin, that kind of thing.
Well, speaking of match cuts and editing, this movie has probably one of the most famous cuts in movies, possibly.
Come on, man. The most famous cuts.
I mean, in both senses, right? Like, it is just a hard edit, right, in that sense, but it's also, someone cutting an eyeball with a razor blade.
Yeah. Which is grody.
Yeah, it's real nasty to look at. It cuts from a sort of close-up of a woman having a razor blade lifted up to her eyeball, and then it cuts to a shot of the moon with a cloud intersecting it, and then it cuts to extreme close-up of an eyeball getting cut by the razor blade, which is not a human eyeball. It is a goat eyeball, I believe, from a dead goat. But it's still a real eyeball getting cut with the razor blade. And it's that thing that editing does where you cut from a real woman's face to a goat's eyeball, and your brain connects the two. So in your head, you're sort of like, that's a real eyeball getting cut.
The eyeball... Oh, wait. But the eyeball is is in front of a human face, right? Like, you're seeing it with an eyebrow and cheek around it.
I remember it like, you can, if you look around the edges of the eyeball, you can tell it's a goat. Like, you can see the hair and the goatliness of it.
The goatliness.
Like, it's not composited onto a human face. It is like, once you know it's a goat eyeball, it's kind of obvious.
I thought they just kind of like put the goat eyeball on top of her eyeball, but I don't know.
No, I think it's just a straight, real close-up shot of a goat eyeball. But knowing that it's a goat eyeball, you can tell.
Oh yeah, you're right. I do see the hair. I'm just looking at it again.
Okay.
All right. Well, yeah, it fooled me.
Yeah. See, it works really well, and it's just editing. Like, it lets your brain do all the extra work. There's kind of a fun backstory to this movie, which is that Louis Buñuel and Salvador Dali were, surrealist artists working in Europe, and they were swapping weird dreams that they had. And Dali had a dream about ants coming out of his hands, which is a thing in this movie. And Buñuel had one where a cloud sliced the moon in half like a razor cutting through an eyeball. And they were, just swapping all these weird dreams they had. And Buñuel was like, that could be a movie. Let's do it. And so they kind of threw together this, this movie out of a bunch of weird dream imagery that they had come up with. And Buñuel had said about it at some point, no idea or image that might lend itself to a rational explanation of any kind would be accepted. So it's like, it is awesome. Deliberately trying to be irrational, Yeah. Nothing in the film symbolizes anything. The only method of investigation of the symbols would be perhaps psychoanalysis. So it's like, all the imagery in this movie is meant to sort of evoke something in whoever's watching it, but it doesn't actually mean anything beyond just like, this is a weird thing. What does that say to you,
It's evocative. It gives you feelings.
Yeah.
It's it's hard to say that it's actually saying much about the exact content of it. Rather, it's saying stuff about the making of it and the existence of it, like a lot of more modern art does.
Yeah, but I like that sort of approach to making anything. I mean, that's a very...
Yeah. I mean, I think like there are ways that this feels like an advance in film form because other more avant-garde stuff that we've seen before has been a little more literal. Like if you look at either like literal like life and death of a Hollywood extra, right? Or
it's about a very specific thing,
right? But like, and it uses some avant-garde stuff to tell a story that is an actual story. Or the other kind of thing that we've seen is just like form and shape and color, right?
Right, like the Opus movies, yeah.
And this is making deliberately like effects-driven abstract imagery out of real stuff. So it's not like representational so much.
Yeah.
Or if it is representational, it's representing nonsense.
Yeah. But I like the idea of just like filming a bunch of nonsense and then sort of like inviting the viewer to sort of like make sense of it almost.
Yeah.
I think that's a cool idea.
Yeah.
Some people might disagree with me on that, but I don't know. I'm excited by that idea.
But yeah, like lots of I guess the main through line of this is just like gore and body horror almost.
It is kind of a body horror movie, yeah, for sure. The ants coming out of the hands and
ant hands. There's like just a random like disembodied hand on the ground or foot. It felt like the beginning of Blue Velvet in that way. There are pianos with dead cows inside, like grand pianos with dead cows inside of them. There's a death's head moth. There's a guy with his like mouth that has I don't know, like his skin is like over his mouth, a la the beginning of The Matrix. What good is a phone call if you're unable to speak, etc. Yeah, so it's just like lots of really like grody, like unsettling stuff.
It's funny you bring up Blue Velvet. I'm sure David Lynch loves this movie.
Oh sure. Oh yeah.
Like it feels very Lynchian in that way.
Believe it or not, Eraserhead is my most spiritual film. Explain that. No.
Probably what Salvador Dali or Louis Buñuel would say if someone said, "Explain Chien Andalou." No. You do that. That's your job.
Right.
But I guess while talking about experimental film playing with form, we should move on to our first feature.
It is Man with a Movie Camera.
Indeed. Another Dziga Vertov film.
Yeah.
Probably his most famous movie?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
The only one that I'd seen before.
Same. And, you know, when I saw this in college, I was not a fan. I watched it and I was like, this is just a guy messing around with a camera. This is boring and dumb. And he thinks he's cool because he can just like turn the camera sideways or whatever. I didn't like it, but and I remember when I watched Kino Eye, I kind of felt a similar way. Like I don't get what's going on here. I'm getting the same vibes. Like this just seems kind of random and pointless. You know, it had some cool ideas, but like as a thing, it wasn't great. But I quite enjoyed this time on reflection.
That's funny because I feel like when I saw this in college, I really liked it. I was like, oh, this is so cool. Look at all this crazy stuff they're doing. And then watching it this time, I'm like, oh, all right, Dziga, we get it. Like, cameras are eyes. Okay, we know. Like it was a little. I was less impressed with it rewatching it. I think.
That's interesting.
I think honestly, just because of like the greater context, I was like a lot of the ground that it covers. I feel like has been covered with even other earlier Dziga Vertov films.
Yeah.
And
but
yeah, I don't know. It's not bad. I like it.
It feels like a fully formed version of Kino Eye. And you know, it came out 6 years later, something like that. So it's, you know, there has been a lot of development in style since then and form. But like I think it's almost this kind of, what we hear about a lot and what we've sort of seen as we've started watching some talkies is that having a microphone in the scene or in the in the setup necessitated less adventurous camera movement. As camera movement was getting more adventurous, especially with these German and Russian movies. And that just kind of had to all come to a grinding halt as soon as they started introducing sound, where you had to have like microphones in very particular areas and you had to have people standing in very particular ways. And so this kind of feels like a swan song of the kind of adventurous camera movement that silent movies could do that sound movies could not. And also just like the adventurous camera movement, not even just for technical reasons, but when you have sound, there is stuff that there's like a literalism to the world that you are kind of a little more bound to than you are without sound, where you can play with space and time and that kind of thing.
It is almost like without having sound, there's a certain remove you have from the reality of the movie. Like it's already a little bit surreal and a little bit sort of different from reality in that way. And I think that does kind of give more creative license to like try weirder things with the camera or the editing, or to sort of give it a bit more of a this sort of heightened reality to it, that I think, as we'll talk about later, is kind of pulled away a bit in the early sound movies.
But yeah, so I think like as in its place in in the era of silent film as this kind of almost, there are others, but it's almost like the final film of the silent era in some ways. And so it's getting at a lot of the things that make silent film unique. And I think it does have some new ideas, even if it does maybe hit you over the head with them a little bit. So yeah, I liked it.
Yeah, I think it's probably the best of these sort of like Soviet montage silent documentaries. It does feel kind of like the culmination of that like specific subgenre. It does still feel kind of showy, and it doesn't. I don't necessarily know what point it's trying to make, other than like, look at this, it's cool. Look at all the stuff you can do with the camera.
Yeah, that's so interesting that our perspectives swapped in opposite directions. Because that's the exact kind of cynicism that I had when I watched it in college.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't necessarily feel cynical about it. It just is like, I think having seen a lot more stuff from this time period, like having seen a lot more of the like Murnau movies and Fritz Lang stuff, and it's just like I've seen a lot of the technique from this applied in other ways in other films, and so it's a little bit, I'm a little bit less like, whoa, they were really trying some crazy stuff in the 20s, and I'm a bit more just sort of like, yeah, this was around.
Yeah, though I think like another aspect that kind of contextualizes it to me is this just like general celebration of cinema. This movie, not like in the making, in the exhibiting, in what's special about it, all this kind of thing. So this movie starts with a movie theater that has not opened yet. And in like stop motion, or it's not stop motion, I don't think. Maybe they're being pulled on strings or something. But like in anticipation of an audience, the movie theater seats kind of fold down, welcoming your butt into them. And so the first part of this movie, kind of like before it even says part one, I think it's kind of like almost like a prologue, is making you aware that you're in a theater by showing the kind of building anticipation of, we're gonna watch something, isn't it so exciting?
It feels like one of those like the AMC Nicole Kidman movie intro where it's just like, get ready, aren't movies great? Here we go.
Yeah, true. Yep. But
This is the regal first look of 1929.
You're not wrong. But I don't know. I think that there's maybe, I mean, because it's coming from a Soviet, it is less of a commercial, commercial, like, isn't it great to go and spend money at AMC kind of thing, and more of a just like, I love movies. So it's a really drawn out sequence of just this like building like anticipation of like the entire orchestra is set up for the soundtrack, and they're all holding with their violin bows right above the strings. It goes to the projection booth representation, and you see the projectionist threading up the movie and getting it all prepared. He is a really cool kind of detail is that it's a carbon arc projector, which was the only kind of projector back then, which is making an arc of like electricity in between two carbon rods, and you see the projectionist like adjusting the kind of like angle and distance between the rods, which was like part of the process. I've never actually used a carbon arc projector, but that was what they used until they had these super bright xenon bulbs. And so it was cool as a projectionist seeing that process. And the moment that the movie wakes up is the moment that the carbon or that the electricity arcs between the two carbons, and then it's like movies are on now. It feels good. I liked it. Maybe a little corny, but I liked it.
I'm a sucker for that sort of thing. Yeah. Yeah, I feel like this was like less wildly experimental than I remember it being.
Yeah,
because I've seen Berlin Symphony of a Great City now, and I've like there's definitely a lot of stuff that really stuck with me the first time I saw it that is still very cool. Like a lot of the kind of like multiple exposure stuff towards the end. There's that great shot where there's like two shots of a building that are both like rotating simultaneously, so it looks like the building is like folding in on itself.
Yeah.
Really cool. And there's just there's like a stop motion thing of like a tripod doing a dance.
It's a cute little tripod.
Yeah. There's a lot of, as like with some of the other similar movies that we've watched, like cutting between things to sort of create a comparison or a contrast between them. A lot of sort of like showing people in motion and then cutting to different types of machinery to kind of draw parallels there. And I mean it's good.
Yeah.
I feel like I don't want to be too down on it. Like it's a good and cool movie.
It's very much in the vein of City Symphonies, even though this was filmed in a number of different cities, I believe. It's less of a tribute to, but it's structured in a similar way.
Yeah.
Where it's kind of like the beginning of the day when things are about to wake up, and then industry and what people are doing, and hustle and bustle, and then nightlife.
There is a lot of cool footage of, a man with a movie camera, just like that is always kind of cool to see, of like people operating hand cranked cameras and like trying to get into these weird, precarious, sometimes kind of situations. It reminded me of The Cameraman. This is like the documentary version of the Buster Keaton movie, The Cameraman.
But it's also like meta in a way that The Cameraman even isn't, because The Cameraman is just about a guy who is shooting film, and this is about the guy who is shooting the film that you're watching, right?
Yeah.
There are times where you'll see a really kind of crazy shot, and then the next shot that you see is a pulled back shot of the camera guy getting that shot. Like where he's kind of in between two cars, or he's like burrowed under the ground looking at a train or something.
Yeah. Or you see him in like shrunk down on top of a camera.
Right.
Or blown up super big and he's on top of a city.
Which I guess that's some of the most famous stuff from this movie, are these sort of effect shots of like the cameraman mounting the mountain of like scaling the mountain of a big camera, and it's like it's kind of cool, I guess, but I just don't really see. Yeah, it's a little silly. I guess another thing in line with making you aware that you're watching the movie that you're watching is there's a point where it's in the middle of the city symphony stuff, and then the frame just freezes, and you look at a bunch of frames of things that you have been looking at, but with no motion, just a static frame, and then it pulls out to reveal the editor working on the movie.
Yeah,
which is really cool. I think I like cool. That.
And is like we've seen a lot of depictions of people filming movies in movies already, but I feel like this is one of the first times I've seen like the editing process depicted on film.
Yeah, and it was really interesting too, like seeing how she was like cutting up the different segments and labeling them based on like the kind of thing. It made me think about how logistically complex it has to be to make a movie like this.
Yeah, and it's like now we just have like, a folder and an editing software, you got your bins, and like back then it was like, no, they were literal, like you had to hang up each strip of film and like label it and keep track of it all. And I feel like I just missed the boat on that. Like I started like going to film school and like making movies like right around the same like just after that was getting phased out.
Oh man!
So I've never edited on film before, and that's
I thought you made a 16mm movie.
I did, but I did all the editing digitally.
Oh no!
So I've shot on film a bunch, but I've never edited with it.
It's got to be like a whole process, a whole thing with glue and scissors and stuff.
Yeah, but like I don't know, I want to do that. That sounds fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's like specific stuff in this that stuck out to me that was fun. I don't know if it's worth like mentioning all of it. There's like, there's a bit showing someone doing magic tricks, and it cuts to like a bunch of kids' faces. One of the kids' faces is hilarious. It's just like he's so like just confused and amazed at what he's seeing, but he's just like, what even is happening? It's like breaking his brain. And it's really fun.
I'm glad you explained that, because you made the face, and then I'm like, Glenn, we're doing a podcast now.
It's an audio medium. There's a bit where a woman is like at a shooting range, like for target practice, and she's shooting like Nazi targets, like with swastikas on them, like people adorned with swastikas. And I was like, even in 29, when like that was not, they didn't control an entire country yet, the Soviets were already like, fuck the Nazis, we hate them.
Yeah, which, true, based.
Yeah.
I was also surprised to see that, like, because you hear so much about Nazi sympathizers from this time, right? Mm-hmm. A bunch of Americans who are like, those Nazis are really onto something, And, at least, like, Ziga Vertov and that woman who are in this movie, they understand what's up. They understand the Nazis are bad dudes, fascists. A lot of like really fun little details in this movie. It's not too long. It's an hour and 9 minutes, I believe. So it's got just a bunch of really like interesting stuff in it. I like it. I like it quite a bit.
Yeah, cool movie. Another cool movie that came out this year. That also was made in Europe, I guess is the segue. Okay. Is Fritz Lang's Woman in the Moon, Frau im Mond. This movie reminded me of two things, and I feel like it's like place in history almost is really interesting, because it reminded me a lot of the Méliès movie Trip to the Moon.
For sure.
Because it has a very similar, just like basic plot structure. It's about people who go to the moon.
Yeah.
But it is wild to me how much closer this movie gets the depiction of going to the moon to the actual moon landing.
Sure, yeah.
And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, like, the scientific advisor on this movie helped, like, is directly or very slightly indirectly responsible for, like, achieving the actual moon landing.
He's one of those Nazi scientists that I don't know if was he actually involved in NASA. I know he was involved in the V2 project, but
right. He was involved in NASA. I'm not sure if he was involved in the actual, like, Saturn rocket program that ended up actually taking people to the moon. Mm-hmm. But Wernher von Braun was, and he was a student of the guy who worked on this movie.
Yeah. And
Hermann Oberth.
I don't know if this guy was specifically a Nazi at the time.
No, he
Nazis was. He was.
I don't know if he was when this movie was made, but he certainly was later.
Oh, yeah, right. That's what I was saying. Yeah, I'm not sure if he was a Nazi actively in 1929, but he certainly was in the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, and 50s. Like, he continued to be until death. Like, he did not show remorse for his affiliations at all.
Oh boy.
He stuck by it.
But we can thank him for maybe one of the coolest sequences of any movie that I've seen so far. The launch sequence in this movie is so good.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, and it is kind of shockingly accurate to how actual rocket launches in, like, the 60s and 70s look and are just how they function and things like that. Like, this movie gets the science of actually taking people to the moon really, kind of remarkably accurately well, except for a few things. With a few key differences in that actual astronauts unfortunately don't wear chunky cardigans and safari jackets.
Chunky cardigans.
But this is a fantasy.
Well, they found out that you could breathe on the moon, so they decided to dress casual. Just dress a little warm.
They do bring a sort of, like, diving suit, a sort of, like, old-timey, like, brass and rubber pressure suit that is quickly abandoned because they're like, oh no, there's atmosphere here, we can breathe, it's fine.
Well, yeah, or at least, like, they light some matches and they're like, looks like there's oxygen. We haven't analyzed the air that well, but at least there's oxygen.
What could go wrong?
I guess if we back up a little bit, this movie's all about the moon, and like, the first, like, 40 minutes of this movie are pretty boring, I think.
I mean, the rocket does not launch until over 90 minutes into the movie.
Is it that long?
Yeah. It is over halfway through. Does the rocket even launch? So
there's a bunch of stuff that happens on Earth that you could have done in 10-15 minutes.
Yeah. This movie's 3 hours long, and it absolutely did not need to be.
Yeah, I felt so conflicted about this movie because the launch sequence in this movie is one of the coolest things that I have seen in any silent film. It is so well done. It's so tense. It's so well. It's so, like, realistic, and it like just gives you this sense of awe and excitement. And the hour and a half apparently leading up, there's a whole movie that's just about some, like, poorly plotted kind of business intrigue.
Yeah. This movie feels like it has a lot, especially the first half feels very reminiscent of some stuff from Spies, which was the last Fritz Lang movie. Also, this movie's also written by Thea von Harbo. There's a lot of the same cast as Spies.
Mm-hmm. Including Willy Fritz.
Yeah. Or Wally Fritz. Fritsch? Not sure how to say it properly. A thing that I will never say on the show ever again. But there's sort of our lead character, Wolf Helios, which is a crazy name.
That's a Méliès ass name.
Yeah, it really is. So the movie opens with a quote that says, "Never does not exist in the human mind, only not yet," which is, kind of a good quote to start things off with. Mm-hmm. And so Helios is friends with George Manfelt, who is a sort of disgraced astronomy professor. who was disgraced because he had a theory that there was gold on the moon.
Yeah.
And the sort of council of old scientist dudes threw him out, and now he's this like disgraced.
They laughed him out of the room, as councils of old scientists are wont to do.
Yeah. And so now he's like throwing people down the stairs out of his apartment, calling them "you skunk." And but so Helios and Professor Manfield have a sort of like Marty McFly, Doc Brown relationship almost.
That makes sense. Yeah, I can see that.
And they're sort of like Helios is, I guess, an industrialist, and he's kind of making plans to build a rocket to go to the moon. But there's this there's this like secretive cabal of like wealthy people who are trying to control all the wealth of the world, and they sit in a room and smoke cigars and plot to go to the moon, and say things like, "I want the riches of the moon to fall into the hands of businessmen, not those dreamers and idealists." And so they send...
How can you not be on board with that?
They send their like henchman, played by Fritz Rasp. That's his real name. Who's this, very kind of like James Bond villain-esque guy.
He's both a master of disguise, but when he's out of disguise, he looks like Hitler.
Yes.
Which I feels maybe intentional. It had me like looking up like, what did Hitler look like in 1929? And it's like,
about the same.
Yeah. This guy looked like the villain of the movie looks like Hitler, which may not be an accident.
I mean, right, because it is like partially it's like, well, that might have just been like a popular look in Germany in the 20s. I don't know. But then also it's like Fritz Lang anyway was, pretty staunchly anti-fascist. So he might have been already sort of like putting in some kind of like trying to kind of subvert the like iconography of that group already. Mm-hmm. As far as I know, the Nazis were more of a kind of like paramilitary gang almost in the late 20s. They weren't really a sort of like super political group so much as they were like a political party that was fond of like causing violence and attacking people and breaking buildings and such. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I don't know how pointed that is, but that's it. It is like certainly to contemporary eyes. It's like, well, I wonder who the villain of this movie is.
But this group of this cabal, they've heard about the potential gold on the moon, and they want to get in on they want to slice that pie.
Yeah. Slice of that moon gold.
They want some of that cheese. So basically they end up like threatening Helios and saying like, we're going to steal and destroy all of your stuff and blow up your rocket if you don't allow us to participate in your moon expedition.
Yeah. Which the setup of this movie reminded me a lot of The Lost World, and that it has a kind of like crackpot professor who has this wild idea of like a lost place that he wants to go to.
Yeah.
And he is proven correct.
Although he is serving like prospector and then he's looking for gold on the moon.
That's what I mean. He starts as the sort of like crackpot mad scientist character in the beginning, and he over the course of the movie like shifts into being the sort of like crazy prospector.
Gold.
Literally yelling gold, 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 gold. Yeah. So it's like he's two archetypes smashed together.
Which is fun.
Yeah.
I think that like this kind of stuff that's building up like the justification and kind of like stakes of the moon mission. As we were saying, I think a lot of it is overlong and kind of pointless and not super well done.
Yeah.
I think that like what it is doing that's interesting is talking about like the kind of financial incentives going on with like exploration and how how money can corrupt pure scientific exploration and discovery.
Mm-hmm.
Though they are going to the moon to get rich. It's just that some rich people who have a lot of power and willingness to murder are already involved. I guess if you're rich already, you're bad. If you want to get rich, that's neutral.
Sure. Yeah, there's like you said, there's a lot of intrigue in the first half of this thing that is not ultimately. It's like we just want to see people go to the moon, and it's like this could have been set up, and it could have been just as sort of like you could have gotten the audience just as invested in half the time, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But so we finally get to sort of like the planning and the launch scene, which is pretty long. Like it's a pretty involved scene in terms like the rocket is on this like giant like conveyor belt that has to take it from a hangar outside, which is a thing that is like fairly accurate to actual rockets.
And they've got like this kind of this platform that is stabilizing the rocket up until the moment that it launches, and then it kind of like drops the rocket into some water to keep it upright, because it's too light to stand upright on its own. Which also, the kind of like launch platforms is another thing that happens with real space rockets.
They say it takes 36 hours to get to the moon, which I think is pretty generous in terms of how fast the rocket would have to be to actually get to the moon. I didn't look it up how long it takes to actually get to the moon, but it's more than that. I know that
like
much.
3 days or so, right?
Yeah.
This movie also is apparently the first known or documented instance of a countdown to a launch of a space rocket. Some say that it might have even been influential in the way that shuttle launches have gone, just in terms of like you count down from 10,
Yeah.
And then you say blast off.
Yeah. Another thing that I think I was surprised to see in this movie is it shows G-forces and people like getting pushed down as the rocket launches.
Yeah, one of the great like tension building elements in this launch sequence is how there are 2 gauges that they call your attention to, which one gauge is how fast they need to go to break Earth's gravity and get on the right the right course toward the moon, and they need to watch that gauge build up to a certain speed, and then cut it so that they can coast the rest of the way. And then they have another gauge, which is how much G-forces they are experiencing up until this line where they die. Which and so watching the interplay between those 2 gauges, it like adds so much tension to the scene. It's great.
Yeah, there's a lot of like it's like if they can't slow down, they'll like shoot off into space and die. They explained that there was a previous like expedition that tried to go to the moon, but they were lost, and like just no one ever knows what happened to them. Yeah, it's like it's the whole launch sequence is I think a really good example of like building tension and sort of like setting up what could go wrong, and so you're sort of like, ooh,
yeah,
I hope they don't get crushed by the G-forces.
Yeah, you're watching all of them lose consciousness as they approach the death zone.
Yeah. Another thing that it sort of foresees is that it's like a multi-stage rocket, so like as it gets further away from Earth, like it breaks, like there's like, all right, we jettison the back half now, and then it's like so that's a cool thing. I think that they show a sort of diagram of like Earth's gravity and the moon's gravity, and there's like a very short space in between where there's no gravity, which is like in the movie is like 20 minutes, whereas it's days in real life, where it's just like, no, once you're past Earth's gravity, or once you're past Earth's atmosphere, like you're weightless. And also, when you're on the moon, there's a little bit of gravity, but not nearly as much. But still, it's like this movie shows weightlessness in space, which is not a thing that I have seen in any movie before this.
And it looks good, I think, for the most part.
Yeah. It's like it's like recognizable as like, yeah, they're in space. They need to like hold on to stuff to move around. I do think it's funny that they show that there's like a bunch of straps on the ceiling and on the floor that they like put their feet in to walk around. And it's like,
yeah,
I think it's funny that that's how they solved it in this movie, where it's like, no, you just float around and like push off the walls. Like that's way easier to do.
We got to keep our sense of normalcy in space.
Yeah.
I think probably the best little detail about the weightlessness is when they're trying to pour a drink in space, and it's just not pouring out of the bottle, and so they have to sling it out of the bottle into the air, and then it's got some special effects bubbles a la Wings. Of the liquid in the air.
Yeah, so it's still very like, I guess, and yeah, they are still wearing like, ties and like jackets in space, but it is surprising, just like a few decades after a trip to the moon, how much closer this is to what actual space travel is.
Yeah.
And it's like, I mean, this is exactly 40 years before the actual moon landing, which is like not that long of a time, I feel like.
Yeah.
I think like looking back at the Earth, they like look back at it and it's like, yeah, that's what it looks like in pictures.
It's
like,
beautiful too. Like those shots of looking back at the Earth, and then you see, as they're coming near the moon, you see the landscape of the moon rushing by on the bottom of the screen, and then the Earth setting along, like across from the moon. It's so good.
Yeah. Very cool. There's a bunch of plot stuff in this movie that I don't know how much we want to talk about. It's very kind of classical silent movie.
It's a love triangle in space.
Ooh. I think it's very funny that Fritz Lang and Thea von Harbo keep having these like love triangle plots in their movies, because that's literally like their relationship. like they were part of a love triangle. And yeah, there's the Helios, and there's Frida is the girl that goes with them, and there's Hans is like the other guy that works. Frida and Hans both work for Helios, and they're engaged, but Helios is upset about it. Once they get into space, Hans is like, we're all gonna die. We're never gonna see Earth again.
He succumbs to space madness, which we've seen in madness. We've seen in Himmelskibbet. We have some space madness as well. Some kind of backstabbing once on the spaceship.
So yeah, once they get to the moon, there's like a little bit of exploration going on. They discover that there's breathable air. The professor goes off to find gold, which he does, but then he gets chased by Turner, who's the spy who gets sent by the Cabal on the moon mission.
There's a point where Turner is... Yeah, everybody's passed out from the G-forces, and they're like, "Is he dead? Like, does that? Have we lucked out that he just died?" One other element is that also there's a scamp who stows away on the
of course,
on the spaceship.
Yeah. There's an urchin child who stows away in the spaceship,
which is great. I love that.
Yeah. But so the professor gets chased by Turner, and he's going gold crazy. He's turned into a prospector on the moon, and he falls down a chasm, a crevasse of sorts, and dies. And so then they go out looking for him, and Turner tries to kind of like take a bunch of gold and take over the ship. But Frida locks him out of the ship with her arm. She's like barricaded the door. And Helios comes back and has a fight. There's a moon fight. And Hans shoots Turner. And with his dying breath, Turner admits that nobody loves him, which is why he's a bad guy. But in the gunfight, one of the stray bullets has ruptured the air canister, so now they only have half the amount of oxygen that they need to return to Earth. So even with all the people that have died already, Hans and Helios draw straws for who has to stay behind on the moon because they don't have enough air to get back. Mm-hmm. And they do best 2 out of 3, and Hans pulls the sword straw 2 out of 3 times and doesn't take it well. So then Helios kind of decides...
he's gonna be back on Earth, and I have to stay here.
Yeah. So Helios decides he's gonna stay behind instead. And there's sort of a tearful goodbye. And Helios sort of like walks alone into the lunar wilderness. But then the movie ends on Frida stayed behind too, and so they are now the only 2 living people on the moon. But at least they have each other. She becomes the woman in the moon, I suppose.
Yeah, I was kind of expecting like that they'd find an alien who would be the woman in the moon.
No aliens.
Yeah, I guess she just kind of flip-flops on the love triangle situation. She's like, my husband went crazy. And he's acting a fool, so I'm gonna stay on the moon with you, Helios.
Yep. Staying on the desolate moon with you is preferable to spending the rest of my life with this clown.
Spending the next 36 hours on a on a spaceship with this guy.
Yeah. So yeah, not a perfect film, but there's a lot of fun, cool stuff in it.
Yeah, there's a lot of good in it, and a lot of less good in it.
Yeah,
as well. Another movie from Germany,
indeed,
is Pandora's Box, directed by G.W. Pabst.
George Wilhelm Pabst. The first thing we've covered from him, I believe.
Yeah, I think so. This movie is kind of one of the big hitters of the silent era. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty famous movie, especially for what's her name? The
Louise
main actor.
Brooks.
Louise Brooks's performance as Lulu, the main character in this movie.
It's kind of the big Louise Brooks movie.
Yeah.
Like it's her kind of big lead role in she is the lead role in a couple things, but this is kind of like her biggest, most famous movie.
Mm-hmm. And this is a very famous movie and very well respected, and I think it sucks. I don't like this movie.
I am like confused by how I feel about this. Like, I think there's a lot of good stuff in this movie and like a lot of things that I like respect or like about it, but it's very weird. What it's trying to say is weird. How it handles its character arcs and like how the characters are represented is weird. There's like things in it where I'm like, this is almost very good, but there's something that's holding it back, and I haven't really been able to fully synthesize what it is about this movie that sort of like is off-putting.
I mean, we've talked about how once plot and style got going enough in movies that they're kind of developed this sort of intangible thing that it's just like, this works and this doesn't work, right? And it's the kind of thing that you can't define, but like once stuff became like storytelling became complex enough, you started seeing these kind of like ineffable ways that movies work or don't work. And I think this one just doesn't work in that way. I feel like I don't buy any of the characters. I don't buy any of their decisions or like I don't get emotionally invested in them. I don't think that the plotting is very well told at all. And I think that this movie is just like sadistic for no reason. It's a slog to watch.
It kind of is, yeah.
It is just cruelty with no reason. It feels like a D.W. Griffith movie in terms of like how much it like fetishizes like
misery.
Dark stuff happening, misery, but like without even Griffith's kind of like picadillos that make his films kind of unique, be it racism or just like his various obsessions and stuff. Like, this movie just feels like a D.W. Griffith movie with no soul.
Yeah, damn. I do think Louise Brooks is good in this movie.
She is very good in this movie.
I don't necessarily know if her character is written well, but I think her performance is very good. And I think you can tell, her like charisma comes across very well in this movie. And I think Louise Brooks I get the sense, had a pretty good understanding of how film performance works or doesn't work. Like, I think this is a better film performance that I'm used to seeing from silent film.
Yeah, she's great. She's great.
Yeah. Louise Brooks is, for those who don't know, is kind of like the iconic, like, 1920s, like, bob haircut woman. Like, she wasn't the first one to have that haircut, but it's kind of like, she's kind of the reason why it's like so iconically associated with the 1920s. She was American, but was like a big part of like the 1920s showbiz party scene, and left Hollywood for Germany in 1928 because she was like, I'm sick of this.
She wasn't getting good parts, and she didn't feel like she was being respected in Hollywood.
Yeah. And said later that as soon as she went to Germany, she felt like she had so much more respect than in Hollywood. Although I think she went back to Hollywood pretty soon after, in like 29 or 30. So
yeah, in going to Germany, she broke her contract with Paramount, I believe, and because she did that, they kind of like blacklisted her almost from working that much anymore. So it became even more difficult for her in Hollywood after she came back.
Yeah. How to summarize this movie?
This movie is about a lady who's so hot that it causes
the world to break.
Yeah, people want her so bad that just chaos breaks out everywhere she is.
Yeah, but I feel like this movie doesn't. Yeah, it's like during parts of the movie, it feels like it's kind of like blaming her for that, and other parts it feels like she is kind of being victimized by the people around her, who are all sort of like trying to use her for their own ends.
Yeah, if this movie has anything to say, even if it muddles it by the end, it's the way that like men can like see women as like sexual objects and pass them around like footballs and treat them as like trophies and just not as real people, and how being an attractive woman can put you in a bunch of like dangerous and awful situations with men. But then, yeah, there are points where the movie just kind of goes like, but it's your fault too, you know?
A little bit, yeah. I feel like, yeah, I think the things in this movie that work the best are its kind of depictions of like selfishness, and how like, I feel like every character in this movie is selfish in some form, and it usually has some sort of karmic effect on them, except for one character who is maybe the worst person in the whole movie, which is Lulu's father, who is just a huge piece of shit and doesn't really ever get a comeuppance for it.
He's very supportive, but he is a complete scumbag.
He's a complete scumbag that is really only using his daughter in order to like further his own like addiction for like booze and drugs and life. Pudding, yeah. Yeah, this movie feels very critical of showbiz in that sense of like, showbiz will eat you up and spit you out kind of. Yeah, it's like, I feel like this movie has things to say, but it doesn't really do a great job of saying them, almost.
Yeah.
And like at times feels like it's actively like undercutting itself.
Yeah. It's basically like it's broken up into something like 8 acts, and every act is basically you're in a scenario with Lulu, and then something terrible happens that causes them to have to go somewhere else, and then and then that's the next act, and repeat the process.
And it gets worse each time.
Yes, yeah, they get more destitute and horrified every time.
Yeah. It starts out where Lulu is like the mistress of a newspaper publisher who feels kind of maybe like a thinly veiled analog for William Randolph Hearst.
Oh, I didn't think of that. Yeah. And Louise Brooks was
Marion Davies, kind of.
Niece, I believe. Yeah, she was involved with William Randolph Hearst and actually like had a another kind of real life horrific thing is that she had a fling with she had a fling with Marion Davies's niece, and when Hearst found out she was a lesbian, the niece, he had her committed to a mental institution where she jumped off the roof.
Right.
So, yeah.
So, I mean, this, I'm sure that played into Louise Brooks's performance in this movie. Like, she probably had a lot of real life things to, like, draw upon, kind of. Mm-hmm. But, yeah, she ends up being framed for the murder of the newspaper publisher because the newspaper publisher tries to get her to shoot herself, and there's he gets shot instead.
He says, "Kill yourself so that you don't drive me to murder as well."
Yeah, a normal thing to say to a person. There's a bit early on where she says, "The only way you're going to get rid of me is you'll have to kill me." And I'm like, never say that to someone that you're sleeping with for their money. But yeah, there's like a lot of this showbiz stuff early on where like she is kind of trying to like use this connection to the newspaper guy to like further her career, but she's also like involved with other people at the same time. The newspaper publisher guy is trying to marry this other woman, but then that gets ruined. So he's like, fine, I'll marry you instead. He gets shot in the sort of like scuffle that they have, and Lulu is put on trial for murder. But then her dad, Shigolsh, and the other guy that is around her dad that he just kind of pals around with, pull the fire alarm, and they escape to places unknown. I kind of assume Morocco, to a sort of casino boat place.
Yeah, on the way, they're like on a train. The guy spots her from the newspaper, and he threatens to turn her in. And it's just like all this once she is on the lam, there are all of these people that are holding this threat over her head of, I will turn you in for money. Yeah. And so you have to do what I tell you to do, up to and including like, I'm going to sell you to a brothel.
Yeah. Basically, it gets worse and worse and worse until they're living like destitute in London. And so they all have no money. Shigolsh is like spending all their money on booze instead of food. And so Lulu is turning to prostitution to get money for food. But unfortunately, the first person that she picks up off the street is a serial killer. Maybe the Avenger from the movie The Lodger.
Yeah, I mean,
who murders
and on Wikipedia, it straight up says that he's Jack the Ripper.
Which doesn't make sense, because Jack the Ripper wasn't murdering people in the 20s. It was way too late for that.
Right. I mean, I guess I was like, if it's Jack the Ripper, does that mean this like set 40 years earlier or something?
I think that's just Wikipedia being silly. It's a clearly Jack the Ripper inspired, London murderer of prostitutes in the foggy night. Which is also what The Lodger is inspired by. And yeah, it ends on such a dour, sad note where like she gets murdered. Yeah. And it like barely even spends any time to like reckon with that or like what, it's like it happens off screen. And so yeah, it definitely left kind of a bad taste in my mouth.
Yeah. There's no point to this movie.
There's a definitely a degree of sort of like kind of victim blaming of like Lulu is this like free-spirited, like sexually liberated woman who's like trying to live her best life. But she's kind of
pixie dream girl.
But she's doing it by like sort of getting involved with all these like really selfish, awful people. And so that ends up being kind of her downfall, I guess. It feels thematically a little confused, and maybe that's something to do with like kind of the different perspective that I have as a contemporary person versus late 1920s Germany, because that's something that I feel like is a through line through a lot of the movies that we watched for this year, is this like very weird view of like romantic and sexual relationships that feels simultaneously like it's trying to kind of celebrate a degree of like liberation, but it's also like so like judgmental.
I mean, you could compare it with like slasher movies in the 80s, you know, where it's like it wants to have its cake and eat it too, with like, you know, all of these like liberated people, but then they must be punished by Jason, you know?
Right. Which I guess is that I think applies to this movie the most. I feel like with some of the other ones, it's more just like, oh, this movie has dog shit politics and it's in its depiction of humans.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a good segue to our next movie.
Yeah, speaking of a bunch of a miserable showbiz assholes being mean to each other, the Broadway Melody.
The Broadway Melody.
The Broadway Melody.
MGM's first all-talking picture.
All talking, all singing, all dancing. First Sound Academy Award Best Picture winner. Often said online as the worst Best Picture winner.
I haven't seen them all, but boy howdy, this one makes a case for it. Because this movie is terrible. Yeah. This movie's real bad. It is a similar kind of like showbiz. Well, this movie's billed as a comedy, and it is. I don't think it's ever funny.
No.
And it is fairly exemplary of. I mean, this is our first episode talking about all talking pictures, right? Like we've really only covered The Jazz Singer, which is like barely a talkie, right?
Yeah.
It has like 3 scenes of talking in it.
Yeah, and so this movie is like illustrative in the challenges that early talkies faced.
Yeah,
in
this
many ways.
movie has like all of the pitfalls of early talkies. I mean, a thought that I had after watching this movie, and probably the next movie we'll talk about, is talkies were a mistake. Like there was such a significant shift between just the overall like language of the filmmaking of all the silent movies we've been watching and these early sound movies, where it's just like this, they immediately feel so much worse, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is the case every time they make some kind of technological leap, though. We've seen this time and time again, where it's like when they go up to feature films, the first movies are kind of bad because they don't know how to fill all of that time properly, you know?
Yeah.
With every like kind of major jump, it takes them a while to figure out how to do it.
Yeah. And they certainly have not figured it out yet with this movie. I guess the broad strokes of this is it follows 2 sisters, the Mahoney sisters, Harriet, who goes by Hank, and Queenie, who are like moving to New York to follow their showbiz dreams.
And guess what? There's a love triangle.
Yep. And it's just a terrible one, though, where it's just like...
Yeah.
The only positive scenario to come out... Possible positive scenario is that the Mahoney sisters leave this asshole behind and, like, go off on their own again at the end. And that's not what happens at all.
He is so inexplicably shitty of a person.
Terrible.
I don't understand.
He is mean to everyone he meets. He is incredibly selfish and just a huge asshole and is bad at everything he does. I don't understand why anyone in this movie puts up with him.
But like he's supposed to be like the romantic lead. I don't think it.
Yeah.
Like, there are parts.
No, he's
where
not.
the
He's
movie...
not supposed to be. Like the filmmakers not intend for him to be this unlikable. You know. Even though he is.
He is so awful.
He's the worst. Eddie Kearns is the name of the male lead of this movie, and is a terrible character. Mm-hmm. One, because he is terrible to the people around him, but also just like he does not fulfill the function that he is meant to in this movie, which is to be a like charming romantic lead. He's the least charming human being alive.
So the broad strokes of this movie, they're 2 sisters who have a vaudeville act. They're trying to bring it to Broadway. They kind of have a relationship with this guy Eddie, who has recently landed the kind of a big role, a big kind of main role in a Broadway review, and he says that you will, he'll help them out by getting in the review and getting them jobs and everything.
Yeah. I'll put in a good word. I'll get you hooked up.
And they say it by talking. Whoa.
Yeah, whoa, talking. Which is like, well, we'll talk about that in a second. The Broadway show that is depicted in this movie is the Zanfield Dollies, which is the worst thinly veiled
Ziegfeld Follies.
Yeah. So it's like Mr. Zanfield, and it's like, I wonder who that is supposed to be. There's a few of those in this movie. There's also one of the kind of like villains of the movie is named Jacques Warner, which is very close to Jack Warner, which feels very pointed from an MGM picture. But yeah, there's a lot of talking, a lot of singing in this movie.
And a lot of dancing.
None of it particularly good. Like, this isn't the worst offender of this, I think, but there are a lot of scenes that are just like, and now we're going to stop everything, and someone's going to sing a song. Or someone's going to, like, play an instrument, and we're going to look at this. And I think this movie kind of justifies it by it being a bad Broadway show. So a lot of the musical numbers are sort of diegetic. They're within the world of the film. The characters are actually, like, performing musical numbers to each other as part of a show.
But then sometimes they are singing as if it's a musical, and then there's non-diegetic music playing behind them as well.
Yes. So it's sort of a mix of both.
Yeah.
I feel like I could spend this whole time just talking about what a jerk Eddie is in this movie. That's like most of my notes are that. Everyone who works on this Broadway show seems to hate each other. Everyone is like literally about to murder each other. There's one of the like tech guys throws a light off a scaffolding at one of the actors, and I'm like, that would kill someone, to throw this like massive metal light that then shatters onto the floor.
They're also like snippy and catty and mean to each other at all moments. Like every moment of this movie is just like cattiness.
Yeah, but then like I feel like the overall impression isn't that like, I don't feel like this movie is trying to posit that like Broadway shows are a terrible place to be.
I think what it's trying to be is like affably like mean, right? It's like people are mean, but you're having a fun time. It's like it's endearing, but it certainly is not.
Yeah, it is not remotely endearing. One thing that's kind of interesting about this movie is like it opens in a music studio for musicians, and it opens with this like overlapping cacophony of talking and music, which is kind of
a racket.
Right, but it is kind of like, hey, we can have talking and music in our movies now. Let's have like 8 people talking and singing in the first scene, all overlapping. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this movie ever really uses music or talking in a particularly interesting way. It just has a lot of it.
Which I mean is unique, right? It's much more dialogue driven than a silent movie could be. I believe there was a silent version of this, but but also the talking isn't really doing that much, you know. They're not really saying stuff. Like, this is a story that could have been done in a silent movie.
Probably. One thing with it, I do think, like we were just saying before about like how it affects performance, is I think it makes performance a little bit harder to do. Like, it raises the bar. Having sound in your movie means that like when your actors talk, they need to be able to deliver their dialogue in a believable fashion.
Yeah.
Which I feel like this movie does not do very well.
Yeah. At the beginning when I was watching this, I thought like, okay, like it, you know, it's not naturalistic certainly, but it's like a Broadway style overacting. And there's some of that, like this kind of like talking to a big crowd as if, hey everybody, la, 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 you know. But my opinion went from this is Broadway style overacting and that's okay to, oh, this is actually bad acting.
Yeah. This isn't the sign of the times. This is just bad performance. My favorite scene in this movie is does not have very much dialogue in it. Surprise, surprise. It's like one of the few moments of like actual pathos or emotion I felt in this entire thing is maybe like 2/3 of the way through, towards the end. So there's this love triangle between Eddie and the two sisters. Eddie is like initially involved with Hank, but is sort of like trying to seduce Queenie like behind her back the whole time. a real charming, likable thing to do. And eventually that, like, it comes out and Hank reveals that she's known that for, months or whatever. And she's like, she accuses Eddie of being a coward for not chasing after her sister that he's leaving her for. And so he storms out. And she just breaks down crying in her dressing room. And that was like the one moment of like performance that I really felt was like,
yeah,
just her life is in shambles, right? Like her boyfriend has left her for her younger sister, and like everything that she's like hoped and dreamed for is like falling apart. And she just like sits by herself and cries. And that I feel like was a genuinely good performance in that moment.
Yeah. And after Eddie leaves her, I think it's her uncle Jed, maybe, or even maybe it's Eddie, I don't remember, who says, "She's a born trooper. Troopers have no home. They're just tramps." So, like, basically, like, there's this whole thing of it's just like Queenie is the pretty one, and and Hank is the one with business sense. They kind of look more or less the same to me, you know? But like everyone wants the pretty one, and she's like, "I know I'm not the pretty one. I'm just destined to be a tramp the rest of my life."
Right, but the movie ends with her just like accepting that about herself, and like she's like, "Oh, everyone says that I'm only good at this one thing, so I'll just do that, I guess."
Yeah.
I hate the ending. The ending of this movie is awful, and is like just it is like the worst possible scenario. I feel like it's so I hate it. It like makes me angry.
Yeah, there's a point where it's talking about Hank, and then somebody says, those guys aren't gonna pay $10 to look at your face. Like, it's Broadway. Horrible. Yeah.
There's also a moment where Eddie starts a fight with Jacques over Queenie, and immediately gets his ass kicked and like thrown out of an apartment. And he's like, "Oh, you don't want anything to do with me. I'm no good." And I'm like, "You are correct, sir. That is the one true thing you have said this whole movie." But so they end up getting married and moving to Long Island. And like Hank kind of starts her own traveling show with a new dancer that replaces Queenie, who then immediately starts flirting with Eddie when they meet. And it's just like, see, this is not going to end well for anyone. Like, this is just a cycle that's going to repeat. But the movie doesn't seem to acknowledge that whatsoever. And ends with Hank sort of going off to Peoria to do her show and saying, "It's cream in the can, baby," which I assume has some good connotation, but I have no idea what that means.
Oh God, yeah. Wait, I just wrote down another one of the mean things that was said. I know this is not related, but they're talking about showing Hank's like profile, like the side of her face. Someone says, "Your profile was ruined the day you were born."
Oh,
horrible. I keep looking at my notes and just like looking at all the heinous stuff that people said that I wrote down.
Yeah. Some other awful things that Eddie does is there's a bit right where they're talking about how like Queenie is sort of like going off on her own and like getting involved in with, men of low character or whatever. And Hank is like, "Hey, well, at least I still have you," to Eddie. And Eddie is like, "Bye." Immediately just leaves. And then later he's talking to Queenie and he says to her, "Whether you like me or hate me, you got to pay attention to me," which is some masculine bullshit right there. Yeah. That is like so exemplary of like male entitlement, I feel like.
The best thing about Eddie is that he has got an extremely New Yorkie accent. He says things like "certainly," and he says, "I'll sing you a voice."
Yeah. Maybe that's a good segue to our next movie, which is also a bad sound musical with a lot of New York accents in it. Unless you have something else to say.
The last stuff that I want to say a couple of things about just like the way that having sound is affecting this movie, and the ways that in this movie in particular, more than the one we're about to talk about next, I think there are things that they just have not. Their minds are in a silent mode, and they haven't done they're not doing talking properly. So in a silent movie, when people are having a dramatic moment, right, there's some dialogue, and then people are just kind of staring at each other with emotion on their face, and because it's silent, they can break time a little bit. You're just kind of imagining how the conversation would go, but what they're doing is just taking a moment to just hang on someone's face as they emote silently. And they do that a couple times in this movie, and it's so awkward because the conversation just stops to look at someone's face for a while.
Yeah, I did notice that. Like, very weird pacing things where it's just like it will stop like mid-scene just to like cut to people's faces, but not in a way that feels natural or like it has any place there.
It's the kind of thing that would have been entirely acceptable in a silent movie, but when you're doing a movie with sound dialogue, the conversation has to flow naturally, and the cinematography has to follow. It has to be in service of a naturally flowing conversation, and in those instances, they're using an antiquated cinematography that did not quite match up.
It does almost feel like a lot of the filmmaking in this and the other early sound features feels like it's kind of going backwards. Like they need to simplify so much to accommodate for sound that it's like a lot of the actual filmmaking feels like it's regressed almost a little bit.
Sure, yeah. There are some at the very beginning. There are some like nice establishing like helicopter shots of
probably
New York
airplane
City.
shots.
Maybe airplane shots, but that's kind of the most adventurous cinematography thing that happens this movie.
Maybe balloon or airship shots. Who's to say?
Yeah, Zeppelin. Another kind of remnant of silent filmmaking in this movie is that they're not using dialogue or kind of visual language to do establishing shots or that kind of thing. There are just title cards that say like a hotel on 42nd Street or 3 weeks later, right? Like, yeah. And so it's like they have not understood how to make a not silent movie yet, you know?
Right.
They're like, we don't know how to justify this transition in space without having a title card that's telling you what's happening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
but then it's still just like all the sound cuts out for those, and it's just like now an intertitle.
Yeah.
In a movie that doesn't need them. Yeah.
Another thing about the sound is that the mixing is awful, which is to be expected in some ways, right? But you'd think that like they had a lot of trouble making this movie. They were figuring out how to make a sound movie while they were making it.
Yeah, they had to shoot a bunch of scenes more than once, I think, right? Just to like get the sound right.
Their rushes would come back and they'd go like, oh, this is crap, we gotta do it again, basically.
Not like doing multiple takes like we would normally in a movie, but I mean like filming a scene, developing the film, getting it back the next day or days later and being like, oh, this is terrible, we gotta redo this.
Yeah.
And doing that for almost every scene of the movie.
And so, yeah, it makes sense, although it's just, you'd think that maybe... I think it reached a low bar of acceptability of just how like cacophonous and poorly mixed the sound is. There's a part with tap dancing in this movie where the tap dancing is so quiet. It's focusing on these feet tap dancing for like a minute or a minute and a half, and it's just a whisper of every tap.
Yeah.
And then two other quick things about this movie are that their Uncle Jed, the sisters, have a kind of manager-esque of an uncle, and he does like a Porky Pig kind of routine.
Yeah, he has a stutter, like a very exaggerated, cartoony stutter.
But then he does the Porky Pig joke of like stuttering to say something and then saying like a kind of alternate version of that thing. I guess it's like a way that they're trying to use sound. It's like, here's a new joke that we can tell with sound. And then my last note is this and Pandora's Box both have some fairly explicit queer characters in them.
True. Yeah.
Pandora's Box, one of the characters who is wrapped into the obsession with Lulu is a woman, and she and she's kind of wealthy. She's the countess, I think, and then ends up kind of giving a lot of money and falling in with their disreputable gang for a while just because she's so obsessed with Lulu. And in this movie, there's a costume designer of the Broadway Melody who he's like, it's very specifically like, we're like, he's gay, but we're not going to specifically say it, but they do all the like right up
all of the cliche sort of mannerisms.
Yeah. He's got limp wrists. He kind of talks in an effeminate way, but I think most notably, there's like a part where like their hats are not fit, like the dancers' hats are not fitting through the doors, and he's talking to the prop designer or the kind of set designer, and he says, "I design the costumes for the shows, not the doors." And then she says, "I know that. If you had, they'd have been done in lavender," which like that's right up until saying it. Oh yeah, so people, there's another part where he kind of like giggles a bunch, and some people mock him giggling and call him a cutie. I mean, you know, it's not the most positive representation of queer characters necessarily, but like
no,
it's not like hateful necessarily either.
It's kind of poking fun at that mocking character a bit.
Sure,
yeah, it is somewhat mocking. I think the kind of depiction in Pandora's Box is less deliberately sort of mocking in that way. Like,
yeah,
I mean, I think Lulu the character is kind of romantically linked to both men and women in the movie, just like Louise Brooks was in real life, even though she considered herself heterosexual, even though she had relationships with women a couple times in her life. Whereas that at least feels like it's coming from a more sort of genuine place, I guess. Whereas this feels more like it's sort of a joke for the joke's sake.
But I guess even like acknowledgement is kind of like, this level of acknowledgement is fairly unprecedented.
True. Yeah. And I think both these movies are kind of examples of the era that we're in filmmaking now, which is pre-code. So it's like there is sound, but it's the Hays Code hasn't really started being enforced that much yet. So there's like a lot more kind of explicit references to sexuality and to crime and things like that aren't, you know, by like the mid-30s are going to get stripped away.
Right. Well, I ruined the segue earlier, but we can segue again by talking about the movie that is by the first out lesbian director, Dorothy Asner.
A different segue to a different film than what I was intending earlier.
Oh, really? Okay, yeah. Sorry.
Now let's talk about The Wild Party.
Yeah, so this is Clara Bow vehicle.
Mm-hmm. Her first talkie.
So this is a movie about an all-girls college, and the kind of free-spirited Stella, played by Clara Bow, who is our main character, and she's just trying to have a good time. And once again, there's a bunch of like dumb, cruel men all around her who are ruining her time, basically. And
I mean, the difference here, and I don't know how much of this I'm projecting onto the movie, is that this one is directed by a woman, whereas the other ones aren't. It was written by two men, but still. I do feel like this movie is a little bit less judgmental of its main character.
I don't think it's that judgmental at all, honestly.
But I feel like the other movies are. I feel like Broadway Melody and Pandora's Box feel kind of judgmental towards the characters in them, whereas this doesn't as much.
Yeah.
This feels like it's actually sort of a story being told from this character's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's still it's still the 20s. It's still kind of a little, it's still a little silly to modern eyes, I think. But I enjoyed this I don't think this movie is even that good, but I enjoyed it so much more than the other sound movies that we watched that I'm like, it felt like such a breath of fresh air, and that it like is competently made as opposed to the other two.
It still has some of the pitfalls of early sound movies. There's some awkward line readings. There's some strange pauses. But I think it feels more like a real movie than the other ones.
Yeah. It feels so much less clunky than... There's another movie that also feels clunky that we haven't talked about yet. But this one felt at least like it was making an effort to actually have a story that flowed and scenes that make sense together in that order and like characters that act remotely human.
Although I did use that word, I did use that key word in my notes here. I said pretty clunky story, but it is less so than...
Right. That's what I mean. This movie is pretty clunky, but it's so much less clunky than some of the others released this year that it's like, oh my god, this kind of like very middling movie feels like a masterpiece compared to some other stuff.
Right.
So we start with Clara Bow is at an all girls college. Clara Bow from Wings and It, which we didn't talk about, but you speak very highly of. The sort of famous... The thing this movie is famous for, I guess, in addition to just being Clara Bow's first talkie, is that because Clara Bow had so much trouble hitting her marks for the sort of planted microphones they had on set, Dorothy Arzner, the director, devised putting a microphone on a fishing pole and following her around with that, which led to the boom mic, which is what we still use now. So I don't know how like true that story is, but this movie is sort of credited as the thing that sort of led to the development of the boom microphone. So that's cool.
Yeah. I mean, like all sorts, like these movies, they're having to do so much to figure out how to do sound properly. And in the next year, I'm getting the sense that like many advancements are being rapidly made in technology to make these movies not as crappy as they are now. The basic plot of this is that she is she's like a kind of free-spirited college student. She's trying to have fun and have a good time. And there is an anthropology professor who she is sweet on. He's an anthropology
professor who is basically Indiana Jones in this movie. Like, he's an anthropology professor that all of the girls are making fluttery eyes at.
Yeah.
And he gets into fist fights and talks about his time in the jungle.
He's Indiana Jones if he were actually enough of a creep to take up that girl with the on her offer that she wrote on her eyelids in the first movie. But so she kind of like pursues a relationship with him, and it's the sort of developing relationship between the two of them. This kind of tension of, will he get fired for going out with a student,
rightfully,
and will her RA narc on her about going out with the professor? But also, like, I think that Clara Bow does a really good job selling it, but this is another movie where, like, Gil, the anthropology professor, is just like a horrible person.
He's not great.
Is so mean to everyone around him. Yeah. And he's especially mean, almost performatively, so to push away any suspicion that they're together. He's performatively mean to Stella as well. In front of all of these people, he like makes her cry and leave the classroom and insults her while she's leaving. And then, there's a point where she's like, do you hate me? And he's like, I do. I hate you, and I love you. It's
Yeah, not a great depiction of romance in general. I think it's a low bar, but I do at least appreciate this movie acknowledging the sort of like moral problems of a professor being in a romantic relationship with his student, and how it's like they could, both the characters and the movie is only really fully okay with that once they both leave the college.
I think that this movie has like a valuable insight from a lesbian on the kind of like I don't know, the kind of like boorish male behavior.
I think it definitely stuck out to me that it feels less flippant in this movie. It feels less of a joke and less of a like, oh, men will be men, and more like, oh no, like
more of like a genuine threat.
Yeah, it's like the like drunken men in this movie are genuinely like threatening and scary in a way that they definitely are not in the other movies that we watched. Which is like, yeah, good job, Dorothy. Like, although yeah, Professor Gill is still not the best dude in the world.
That's the thing. It's like I don't super buy their romance, but I think the amount that I do buy it comes from Clara Bow, and I think that the movie acknowledges that there are issues with their relationship, but like because it kind of has this happy romantic ending, it kind of says like we've conquered all of the issues, but like there's still like a lingering feeling of like this is not good though,
Yeah. I do I think Clara Bow is really good in this movie, and I think makes the transition to sound well, even though I think her career kind of suffered from it.
Yeah.
Like, I know that when this movie came out, people were very critical of her voice specifically.
Her Brooklyn accent.
And also just, I guess, like the pitch of it, which I think has more to do with the quality of the microphones in the 1920s than her voice. But it is kind of wild to me that like people were critical of like Clara Bow's sound performance being like, oh, she like can't hack it as in talkies. I'm like, I thought she was very good in this.
No, yeah, she was good, I thought. Yeah, I don't know. Anything else to say about this movie?
Well, there's some funny lines of dialogue, not necessarily intentional. I mean, there's a bit so like Professor Gill fights off some drunken dudes that are like trying to kidnap Stella at one point. And he later gets shot by them off screen, and she finds out over the phone. It's like, oh, Professor Gill's been shot. And the person telling her was like, oh, it's just in the shoulder. It's not dangerous. It's like, what? Yes, it is. You can't get shot in the shoulder and just shrug it off. And yeah,
or
it's
maybe
like
they shot your shrug off.
Yeah. I think this movie incorporates like music and singing into its scenes in ways that feel natural and make sense, unlike some other movies. It's not a musical at all. It's a drama. It's like a romantic drama, but
yeah.
It has scenes of music and singing in it that feel like they are just like, yeah, this is a scene where people are singing, and not like stop everything and just have a long unbroken shot of someone playing an instrument.
Yeah.
Someone else uses the word skunk as an insult in this movie, which made me laugh.
Shut up, Doug.
Yeah. There's a really fun moment of performance from Clara Bow that I'm not sure was scripted or not. There's a moment where Gil holds his finger up to her face to like shush her, and she bites his finger and then kind of like laughs to herself about it. And that was something that I was like, it goes by so quickly, and yet it's like,
that.
It's great. And I'm like, that strikes me as something that might have just happened in the moment. I don't know.
She seems like a fun gal.
Yeah, it is. So yeah, we both had to watch this movie by finding like a weird, like bootleg taped off of TCM version of it online, which is a real bummer because like this movie exists. It just isn't available on any physical media or streaming anywhere. But I think it feels very exemplary of like 1929 filmmaking as a whole. Like it thematically ties in with a lot of the other stuff you watched. Mm-hmm. It's an early talkie, but I think it's a better early talkie than the other stuff that we watched for this year.
Yeah.
It's just like, it's a shame that this movie isn't more easily accessible than it is.
Yeah. It's a decent one. If you're gonna watch a 1929 talkie of the three that we're doing, this one is the one that is the most consistent quality, certainly.
Yeah, and that's not even to say that it's a great movie. It's fine, but at least it isn't terrible. Speaking of terrible movies,
the Cocoanuts.
The Cocoanuts. So, I hated this movie. What did you think?
Oh, I had a lot of fun with it, actually.
So this was the first talkie that I watched of the three.
Yeah, me too.
And I was immediately struck by like how clunky it was, and how this movie basically has no plot and is just a bunch of like vaudeville acts strung together.
Correct.
Poorly. And I don't think I laughed once, even though it is the most explicitly comedic of all of the movies.
Wow. Okay. So this was adapted directly from a stage play. That the Marx Brothers. This is the Marx Brothers. This is our first Marx Brothers picture. And
the first. This is their first. This is their motion picture debut.
They had done this, I think, in 1925 on Broadway.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of fit more into the style of a Broadway review in certain ways. They had been sort of semi-exiled from the vaudeville community, and so took their act to Broadway, but and kept it very vaudevillian. And being a review, being Broadway, it's like there is a loose plot going on, but then there's also just a bunch of like, here, have a song now, and it doesn't really connect that much. It's
or at all.
Yeah, it's something that may work a little better on stage, but in a film, it feels just random out of nowhere.
Yeah, it feels random. This movie more than the others, I think, feels like a step backward in terms of filmmaking, and that it is at times literally just a filmed stage show.
Right.
Like there's very little editing going on. Like it's almost every scene plays out in like a single wide shot. Right. Sometimes they'll sort of punch in to like show other things, but it's like
sometimes they'll punch in to show Groucho Marx mugging to the camera.
Yeah, sure. But it's the most like simplistic filmmaking that I've seen of anything that we've watched in like since like the 1910s. I feel like it's like very, very just like, did we get it on camera? Good, done. Moving on.
Yeah, and including like there are a number of kind of awkward like pauses that would be takes that you would normally not use. There are parts where they like kind of mess up their lines a little bit, and then they keep it in the movie. This was happening. They were filming this. So the next Marx Brothers movie is Animal Crackers, which comes out in 1930, I believe. And that was also adapted from a Broadway show. And it's a Broadway show that they were performing while they were making this movie. So they would shoot this movie. They shot this movie for about 3 weeks. They were shooting this movie in the day and then going and doing a Broadway show at night. And they were all like exhausted making this movie. And they were sometimes kind of mixing the two of them in with each other in their minds. So apparently sometimes they would accidentally do like bits and routines from Cocoanuts when they were performing Animal Crackers. And there is a part in Cocoanuts where one of them starts calling another one the name that they are in Animal Crackers, and then corrects himself back to the other name, and they keep that line in the movie. Yeah, this movie feels very amateurish, kind of like it feels like it's made by people who don't really know how to make movies, which I guess in the case of the Marx Brothers is true. Like their performance style feels very not antithetical to movies, but it's like it feels very stagey. Yeah.
I mean, this movie has two directors, Joseph Santley and Robert Florey, who co-directed the Life and Death of Hollywood Extra.
Right.
Which is like very cinematic and very experimental, and then here it's like I see none of that.
Yeah, what was he doing here?
I mean, yeah, this is like the I don't know, I don't necessarily dislike the Marx Brothers shtick. I just don't think it works in this movie. I haven't seen their other stuff, but it's Groucho's whole thing is just banter. He just says a lot of things at once, and all of them are jokes. Usually with puns. Usually some kind of like wordplay, like dad jokey stuff.
See, this is why I like this movie.
Well, see, yeah. I mean, if that works for you, great. Like, there's, he's like, don't throw that phone. That's only for long distances. It's like, like, this whole movie is like one big long dad joke. And that didn't really work for me. But your mileage may vary, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, well, so this movie got like a couple of like really good guffaws out of me, honestly. This movie is structurally a mess, but when you zoom into like particular parts of it, parts that had been very well practiced and honed on stage, Groucho is throwing out just like joke after joke after joke so fast that like you can't sometimes even parse the last joke before you get to the next one.
Yeah.
But they're all like very like carefully constructed wordplay, I think. And so I think especially with Groucho and Harpo, like that they have hammered out their routines very well. And so the moments that you can just zoom in on them doing their comedy, I think work as well as if you were watching them on a stage. It's just like, it's not very cinematic.
Yeah, I also just found them to be very annoying more than funny in this movie.
Yeah, I mean, definitely Harpo.
With the exception of Zeppo, who doesn't get anything funny to do. He's just also there, as is the Zeppo way. But yeah, that combined with the clunkiness of the filmmaking, combined with the fact that I didn't really find the Marx Brothers particularly funny, made this was a rough this was a slog to sit through for me. There was a couple little chuckles maybe, but like I feel like a lot of it is that a lot of the comedy doesn't feel organic or motivated by anything. It's just jokes for joke's sake. Like the wordplay isn't coming from something where it's like they're not setting up why anyone is saying this stuff. People are just saying things because it's a joke. But it's like, you can't just walk into a room and say something funny and then leave and expect me to be okay with that. Like, it feels very quantity over quality.
Yeah, sure.
You know?
Yeah. It's very, it's not made well, certainly. But one thing that I think is good about this movie, as a movie, is I think it is the only of the three talkies that we've seen to really emphasize talking, right?
Yeah, and like use of language.
Yeah,
as through dialogue. Yeah,
like this is doing jokes that you couldn't do in a silent movie. There are some like silent physical comedy jokes, but like a lot of the stuff with Groucho and Chico. It is it's wordplay, it's like fast, snappy dialogue. It's the kind of thing that you expect from 30s movies, of this like really just snappy
fast talking banter.
Yeah. And so it feels like a prototype for a lot of these kind of these 30s comedies. And I'm interested to see in the future Marx Brothers movies how they refine that. But yeah, the other two movies that we watched, they kind of almost incidentally have talking, and it's like a gimmick. Where this one, it's like, okay, we're gonna take a very dialogue heavy stage show, and then use that now that we have the ability to have dialogue, right? Like you're saying, there's like a lot of a lot of jokes, a lot of dad joke type stuff. You want to get a hold of Mrs. Potter? I don't know. She's awfully ticklish. And then, I have a pass key to every hotel room, every room in the hotel. And then someone says, pass key? And he says, pass key. That's Russian for pass. You know, they pass key down the street ski.
Har, Groucho.
But, I mean, that one in particular, it feels very like Airplane, you know? You could see that like, wordplay, the Groucho Marx style wordplay, being like the root of that type of comedy, that whole like a hospital. What is it? It's a building with sick people in it.
Yeah. I was definitely reminded of, I think the Three Stooges have a similar type of comedy. Mm-hmm. They're also like a bunch of like some brothers from New York that like
slap each other
comedy
around a bit. Yeah.
Right. I've seen a lot more Three Stooges than Marx Brothers, and I tend to like the Three Stooges more, but those are later, and maybe like the Marx Brothers will sort of get into their own, they'll refine their comedy a bit more, and I'll enjoy the later ones more. But I could definitely see their influence on later comedians for sure.
Yeah. Have you seen any other Marx Brothers stuff?
No.
Okay, yeah, me either.
So not a great first impression, but
I guess one other note is Harpo, who is silent, and I guess that's his shtick, is that he doesn't talk, and kind of
he honks a horn instead.
Yeah, he's like a clown. He honks a horn. He walks around and harasses people. And, a lot of the stuff, the comedy from him is just like random, you know, like
yes,
he walks around and, you know, he's near somebody, and so he just like starts eating the handkerchief out of their pocket or whatever, you know.
But it is like, I found a lot of his antics more annoying than funny, where I was just like, get this guy out of here.
Right, and then there's just a part that's like 2 minutes long where he just plays the harp for no reason.
Yeah, unbroken shot of him just playing the harp, which is how he got his nickname. That is how he got his nickname. It was like he plays the harp. But it's like, they never explain why his character plays the harp. That doesn't lead to another joke later on. It's just a non sequitur. Now he plays the harp for a minute and a half. And it's like, it often feels more like a variety show than a movie, you know, where it's just like things happen, but not for any reason. Which I think on stage you can kind of get away with. Like, now this act. Whereas this is trying to kind of make a plot out of it, and it doesn't work.
I think my favorite Harpo joke in this movie is they're kind of goofing around and like harassing a guy, and you know, they're also like a couple pickpockets and petty criminals and that kind of thing. And so this guy like kind of, he pulls his jacket open and reveals a badge that he's a police officer. And then Harpo opens his jacket and he's got a liquor bottle inside. And like,
see, that's like a good sight gag. There are a couple of those in this movie that were probably like the only chuckles I got. That's one. There's another good Harpo gag where him and Chico go to break a guy out of jail, and Harpo like enters frame carrying like 5 different giant tools, like a pickaxe, a shovel, like all this stuff to like, and then he just has the key and he opens it. But like, there was a couple good sight gags like that where I'm like, well, at least they're like using, it's a visual medium, like have some jokes in there.
Yeah, I mean, I think one like fairly visual and filmic joke that they do, although this may be something they could do on stage, was like a Scooby-Doo Looney Tunes style, like go in one door and go out another door and run back and forth kind of thing.
I think that probably could be done on stage. Again, like my problem with that is that it's like, there's no reason why anyone is running through any of the doors. They're just doing it because it's a joke. And so it's like, there's no sense of like tension or reason I should think this is funny other than like,
it goes on too long, funny. Too. Yeah.
And like, that reminded me of in one of the Buster Keaton shorts that I don't think we talked about on the show, but I watched, The Goat. There's a bit where with like 4 different rooms, like 2 on the upper floor, 2 on the lower floor, and people chasing each other through all the rooms and like through the ceiling and through the floor and all those all around, and in the same sort of like cross section style shot. But it's like that, we've had the whole movie to set up why that's happening and why we should care about the characters and who is chasing who and why. And it's like, it's basically the same joke, but done so much better. And that was like at least 5 or 6 years before this movie. And so it's just like, come on, do better.
Do better, Marx Brothers.
That's right.
Well, I guess that's about it for this year. Glenn, what was your favorite movie of 1929?
Are we counting shorts?
Yeah.
Then Skeleton Dance. Like, for sure. No question.
Nice. I initially, for a while, I was thinking that Cocoanuts might actually be my favorite, just because, like, I laughed pretty hard at that movie. But,
I think it was my least favorite.
Yeah. I think that maybe out of respect for what it's doing, I will go with Man with a Movie Camera.
There you go.
Yeah. And so that's about it for that's all for the 1920s. They're over.
Yeah. That's the whole 20s.
They've roared and that was
except for a few exceptions, like we're kind of done with silent movies too. Like there'll be a few more in the 30s that we talk about, but like by 1929 they're kind of out, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, we've kind of half transitioned into sound, but the next year, it's like a bona fide classic in All Quiet on the Western Front.
Right, yeah.
And I haven't seen that movie in more than 15 years, probably, so I don't really remember too much about it, but I feel like it would have been more obvious if the sound were this bad. If it were this poorly put together as these movies are. So maybe they figure it out pretty quickly. We're getting into the 30s. Yeah, it's exciting. The next episode that we're going to be doing is our every decade wrap-up episode. Mm-hmm. We're going to be watching Singin' in the Rain and Babylon, which are two versions of the same movie, that talk about the transition from silent to sound. Mm-hmm. And just going down our top 10s of the decade. I haven't figured mine out yet, but that's exciting that we'll get to do that.
Yeah. I haven't made my list yet either. So
we'll figure out what kind of takeaways that we have from the entire decade. Indeed. And what we're thinking about for the 1930s. So join us next time for that one, and join us the time after that for our first episode in the 1930s. It's gonna be, we got The Wizard of Oz, we got King Kong, we got the movies.
Frank Capra movies. It happened one night. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Some good ones coming up.
Yeah.
Dracula, Frankenstein, The Mummy.
We're getting into the Universal horror era, and we're getting into the Criterion Collection fast-talking old guys era. That's about it for this.
As it's known. Fast-talking old guys.
They're not old in the movies necessarily, but they're old now if they're still alive.
True.
That's it. Follow us on the social stuffs and have a good time. Say hi, leave a comment, and tell us about what movies from the 30s we should watch. We're excited to get into the sound era. The sound era didn't really get off to a good start, really, but but also I love silent movies, but I'm looking forward to something that isn't going to be like silent movies take a lot out of you to watch them.
Yeah, they demand, I think, a little bit more attention. Like you really can't let your attention waver at all, which is like seeing them in the theater is great, but also watching them like at home sometimes it is like, wait a minute, I missed like a bunch of things because I looked away for like half a second.
Yeah, it'll be nice to check out some regular movies.
Yeah, regular movies with talking in them.
Yeah, we're just spinning our wheels right now. Let's end this episode. Glenn.
Indeed.
I'll see you next year.